Thank you, Mr President. And President, today I rise to speak about the Heritage Amendment Bill of 2023. And when I think of the word heritage, to me it means something that's old and something that needs to be protected and needs to be preserved. And if I take myself back to my family farm up at Yea, we had an old homestead that was built back in the late 1900s. And invariably, as buildings get older, you need to do a few adjustments to things. And the veranda had a 9-foot tongue and groove veranda all the way around the homestead, and it needed to be repaired. But at that time when we were repairing it, there were some old newspapers that were preserved there for some years. And we were able to go back and look at time when that first veranda was put down, and were able to relate what the things of the day that were going on. And we found it quite instructive. So once we finished our job of restoring the veranda, we put the current day newspapers down. So probably we would be coming up to that time in the next decade or so that these things will be replaced, so the people that will pull up that veranda will understand the historical value that it had, whatever the news of the day was as we went along. So I just wanted to mention that because I think it's important that heritage, has these links to people over time, and that they should be protected. So this bill affects the portfolio and planning, which is the responsibility of the minister in the other place, Minister Kilkenny. And I make this important side note to congratulate Minister Kilkenny, who in the last sitting week of Parliament on the Wednesday, Ms Kilkenny rose to speak on her first question time in Parliament in her capacity as the Minister for Planning. President, this bill, as I will get to in the bulk of my speech, is widely supported. The amendments proposed in the bill are widely supported by all the relevant stakeholders. Our government has done its due diligence, and I commend the work done and to craft these amendments. The bill's purpose is to make operational improvements to the Heritage Act of 2017. That is, key heritage as well as community groups have been consulted. These include the National Trust, the Royal Historical Society of Victoria, the International Council of Monuments and Sites, and the Heritage Council of Victoria. And stakeholders have made it quite clear consulted parties support the amendments and safeguards which ensure cultural heritage is not undermined. I want to bring reference to the tabling of Statement of Compatibility in the second reading speech. In accordance with Section 28 of the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities Act 2006, the Heritage Amendments Bill 2003 is compatible, or 2023 is compatible. And on the second reading speech, the bill will require searchable versions of the Victorian Heritage Register and Heritage Inventory to be made available online. I will get to the substance of the bill shortly, but I want to associate myself with these remarks. The bill will introduce several practical changes that include the Heritage Council that will be able to call on the funds set aside as a security measure. For instance, this could be a bank guarantee to ensure compliance with permit conditions, or could ensure that when other places have multiple owners, only those directly affected by the Act need to be involved. And importantly, it prevents someone from being guilty of an offence if they are acting in accordance with a notice or order served on them. So, what is the bill actually trying to accomplish? It responds to problems that became evident during the pandemic. Clearly, when people were in lockdown, it was unreasonable to demand access to documents in person. Therefore, the bill provides for online access to heritage hearing documents and notices. It also removes the requirement that during a state of disaster, that documents need to be provided in person. Something quite reasonable if you ask me. But ensuring transparency, it always allows for online access of these important documents and public notices. And in addition, it clarifies that the Heritage Council can conduct a hearing online at any time. These amendments also creating an avenue for proactive assessment. I think of a tragedy of the Corkman Hotel in Carlton as the Ministers for Planning at the time, recently retired member in the other place, Minister Wynne, said that the government would review penalties after the Corkman pub was demolished. Indeed, Minister Wynne went on to say that, in quite colourful language, that these cowboy developers thumb their nose at Victoria's building and planning laws, and that willful and illegal destruction of our heritage will not be tolerated. Will not be tolerated, and I agree it must not be. Heritage is important, so proactive assessment of the significance of the affected places and objects will be completed by the Heritage Victoria and the Heritage Council long before the project begins. In the early stages of major infrastructure projects, again, this makes sense, and it makes operational improvements that resolve issues that have arisen since the original piece of legislation, namely the Heritage Act of 2017, which has come into force. But I now know I have said what the bill does. I want to let everyone know what the bill does not do. I know it is important to outline the scope of the bill for everyone's sake. The bill only deals with significant state heritage. Local heritage is managed by local government, plain and simple. It's managed in accordance with the Planning and Environment Act. Local heritage is protected by this. Namely, it is protected by the heritage overlays included in local planning schemes. And Mr President, I had the opportunity to visit the St Kilda Town Hall, or the one in South Melbourne, and it had some structural issues that needed to be dealt with after a water pipe burst and the water collapsed the roof internally. And when we were in there, we were able to observe some of the intricate work that was done by a lot of the craftsmen many years ago. And to replicate the work that was done all those years ago was quite a task for the current day builders. And the carpenters and plumbers were able to certainly replicate that work to great effort. And it's quite interesting when you see these town halls from the outside, you don't sort of have an understanding what they look like from the inside. I don't think you would give them a second thought as you drive past them, but having the opportunity to go through the building itself, you just look at the size and scope of the building that was put together many years ago. It's really important that we protect and ensure that the buildings maintain their livability and their opportunity for the public at large to enjoy them. So I wait with bated breath to see the conclusion of all that work that's been done. I think it's going to take some years for it to come to its full completion, but the work that's been done by the tradesmen and all those involved is certainly doing everything to make sure that these things last another 100 years. So, President, I note the contributions in the second reading Legislative Assembly in the last sitting week, that it is always a pleasure when the House can work together in a bipartisan fashion. And I'd like to draw reference to the member for Gippsland East in the other place, Mr Bull, who noted that the bill was uncontroversial. And I would also like to associate myself with the remarks of the member for South Barwon in the other place, Mr Cheeseman. Mr Cheeseman spoke on his time on the City of Ballarat Council and the importance of preserving our heritage. The member for Ovens Valley in the other place, Mr McCurdy, said, and I quote, "Work the Heritage Council and the Heritage Victoria do is vital in ensuring our history is preserved for the future generations." And finally, in referencing other members' contributions to this important amendment from the other place, the member for Laverton, my friend in the other place, Ms Conley, talked about the importance of preserving buildings for history and the legacy of the Labor history. This reminds me of the importance of the Curtin Hotel, a place dear and near to me, to many in this place, and indeed those in the wider union movement. Just across the road is the Workers' Parliament, and I know the importance and significance of having its heritage preserved. And given all of the works that were undertaken there earlier on, some of the things that were discovered once the facades internally were pulled down, it was just astounding that we were able to preserve them for all time. And in the main hall room there, there's a number of times I've attended meetings in there, and it's just magnificent to see that they are still there for all of our union delegates and members to see. I'd like to talk about the bill in detail now. In Division 1, it outlines that the Principal Act contains several notification and publication requirements. These amendments proposed by the Division allow for the Heritage Council and Executive Director to be able to be compliant with the law, but through the new means of online publication. Basically, these amendments modernise the Principal Act. It allows it to be met in a more modern manner, and it minimises the fear of breaching the law that could happen if there were disruptions like we had recently seen in the pandemic. I'd also like to talk to Division 2, or amendments in relation to hearings conducted by the Heritage Council. This is similar in purpose to the previously outlined purpose of the bill. Part 12 of the Principal Act governs the conduct of the Heritage Council hearings. Division 2 of Part 2 of the bill makes a few amendments to Part 12 to allow the Heritage Council to conduct hearings electronically. Let's be real, basically half or more of our meetings these days are electronically. Why shouldn't these meetings take place electronically? It's a no-brainer. The purpose is clear. It allows for Heritage Council to have a greater flexibility in conducting proceedings and also to minimise the disruptions to orderly business if the situation arises again where people cannot meet in person. There are also a lot of housekeeping measures in this legislation. For instance, Clause 35, Clause 36, Clause 38, Clause 40, Clause 41, Clause 43, Clause 44, Clause 47 and Clause 52. They all amend a relevant section of the Principal Act to incorporate references to additional land. This goes back to the sort of work we did a few weeks ago on the Statute Law Amendment Bill, ensuring properly written, cohesive legislation. But here is a big clause, Part 1, and I want to read it. Under Clause 57 of the Explanatory Memorandum to the Heritage Amendment Bill of 2023, Clause 57 amends Section 87 of the Principal Act. Section 87 sets out offences in relation to knowingly or recklessly performing certain activities in relation to registered places and registered objects. The clause amends Section 87 to provide that these offences do not apply to works or activities carried out in accordance with permits issued under Part 4 or show cause notices or repair orders or rectification orders, end quote. And Clause 58 sets out offences in relation to negligently performing certain activities in relation to registered places and registered objects. Unfortunately, it was too late for the Corkman Hotel, but not too late for the future heritage sites. This bill is important. We also will be making the process more transparent and consistent in other ways. This includes nominating and including places the objectives in the Heritage Register in a more open manner. How? Nominations to add land and objects integral to places will, assuming this law is passed, but subject to the same provisions as other nominations. Applications are to be made on a prescribed form. This is accounted for in the new Section 27A and 27B. Owners must now also be notified of a decision regarding a refused nomination and any other outcome by the Heritage Council if their property is going to be nominated to be Heritage Register. And now the Heritage Council will be able to hold hearings on any matters that may be relevant, not just limited to the matters that are raised in submissions. As I wrote this, I could not help consider the own areas in the electorate that are heritage worthy. Like any other member, I'm a bit biased, but I could not help think about this legislation ties into that, particularly the proactive assessment of some things heritage, which this bill actively considers. Think of Chapel Street, which is less than a few minute walk from my office. Most of the buildings date back 3 periods, either in the 1860s, the 1880s or the 1890s, and the Emporium developed stage of 1900 to 1915. The Windsor section in that beautiful neck of the woods, some of the buildings date back to the 1850s. Modest in scope but rich in history. The Heritage Act provides protection for these historic places. Places that are currently protected by the Heritage Act include Flinders Railway Station, Ned Kelly's boyhood home in Beveridge, and indeed this very building, this very room. So as I mentioned in my contribution to the debate on Human Sources Management Bill 2023, our government is proudly and widely consulted on these matters. We want our laws to be the most effective possible. That is why this government has taken the place with heritage bodies, non-government organisations and government agencies. These include the exhaustive lists of major transport infrastructure authority and the Department of Transport, the Heritage Council of Victoria and others. The fact is these consulted parties to support the amendments as safeguards that ensure that the protection of cultural heritage. They are supported as amendments and that ensure recognition of these sites and so much more. Thank you.
Ms Park.